Now it's time to set up a pass for one of our other fruit flavors. And what I want to do is to just rename and reuse this vertical gradient pass. So let's go to the groups tab, expand out our iterations version 1, then passes, and then we have a vertical gradient right here. We can just right click, rename. We'll call this one pineapple. Okay, so now we have that all set up. Before we press on here, let's take a look at what channels are currently in this pass. Currently, we just have a vertical gradient and the other radial gradient toggled. So we could delete these out if we don't want them, but we want these exactly how they are because we'll be using a vertical gradient for the pineapple. Let's jump outside of our pass and go into setup mode. And the reason we're doing that is because we want to create everything inside the scene in setup mode. Now, that said, you can create anything inside of a pass. Just know that it will be created in setup mode. And if you say happen to toggle something like we've done with these two gradients inside of the pass, they'll be toggled to whatever setting you have until you go to setup mode. And in which case, they'll have the same value as you had in the pass. Let's say you didn't want that and you turn said value off in setup mode, that change will then be propagated to the pass anyway. So, long story short, create things in setup mode and then toggle them in the pass. Otherwise, you'll be just doubling up on the amount of work you're doing. So, let's get to this. Let's expand out our box master, the box, and we'll start with the top left-hand cherry. We'll be making a pineapple right there as well. So it's under the top front logos group. And for organizational purposes, we need to make a group for the cherries here. So let's go ahead and do that. Inside of the top front logos group, add layer, group. It looks like it went to the bottom. We'll put this at the very top. Let's rename this to cherry logo. Click the top one, hold down shift, and then the bottom one. And if they're not adjacent to each other, you'll need to hold control to do that. Now we can click and drag and put that into its own little group. Now that has absolutely no bearing on the shading. That's just for visual representation and organizational purposes in the shader tree itself. It also gives us a way to toggle the group in the shader tree when we want to set this on or off or pass. So very handy to have. Let's create another group in the top front logos material group, and we'll call this one pineapple logo. Let's just go ahead and start from scratch with this. Now we could go and duplicate the cherry logos and swap out those images. However, if you duplicate instances, sometimes they can get a little crazy and you'll have to do a bunch of work to fix what texture locators these layers are using. So let's just start fresh and add a new image. The other reason we duplicate this instead of setting this up for a pass is that if we go into the cherry Modos, go to the properties tab, you'll notice that there's no way to keyframe what image is being displayed. So as I mentioned in the past system basics video, that only certain things can be set up in a pass, and generally something that can be keyframed is one of those things. Hence, this one can't be set up there. So we'll have to just create a new layer for it. Now it's time to add a new layer for the image of the pineapple. So hit add layer, go to image map. We use the clip browser, select the pineapple, and you'll see it's obviously gigantic, and it looks like it's also set to the UV map under the texture locator. So let's go to the texture locator tab and change the projection type to planar. We do want this along the Z, so that's correct. The scale, on the other hand, is quite large. Let's just go down to something a little more realistic for the size of our box, say 4 centimeters. That is almost completely accurate. However, the image is being squashed a little bit along the X because of the scale of our texture locator. And what we need to do is either scale up the Y or scale down the X. And what we'll do is we'll scale up the Y. We'll change this to about, we'll say 5 centimeters. Looks like we need to move the texture locator. And what we should do is just move it up here anyway, where it belongs. So we'll place it right about there. And we need to turn off the horizontal and vertical repeat. Let's go to reset. And that's pretty much where we want it. We don't want the pineapple sticking out of the top of the box too much. So let's scale it down on all axes and make sure we retain the proportions there. So use the center cyan ring to do that. We'll move it over a little bit more to the left. In fact, it needs to go down a little bit more as well. Let's just rotate our view and bring it in closer to where it needs to be. Let's let render do its thing. Yeah, right about there, but we'll move it up a little more. Let's rotate this as well on the Z-axis and move it in a touch. We just want to hide that center point of the starburst. So right there should do it. Now we can go ahead and create our bump and specular maps for this. So let's right click on this layer, create instance, and we want to match the settings from the cherry logo. So let's go take a look at the specular layer here. And the low value is 50, the high is 80, the opacity is 2%, and it's also inverted. So let's go make those changes to the pineapple spec layer. So opacity is 2, it's inverted, low value of 50, high of 80. All right, so that's good. And now we can right click on the effect for this layer and set it to specular amount. Now we can make the bump layer. Let's right click on the diffuse layer here, instance. We'll put this one at the top of the group. And let's go take a look at what the bump settings are for the cherry Modos. So basically just the low value is the only edited channel, and we'll change our pineapple one to correspond. That's 20%. Now that we have our pineapple all set up for the top left-hand corner here, it's time to go to the pineapple pass. But before we do that, we need to turn on auto add and also hit apply to apply the changes to setup mode that we've just done. Not that it's absolutely necessary, but as soon as you start working with passes, generally a good idea to make that happen. So let's go to our pineapple pass, see the vertical gradient change, and we want to turn off all of the cherries for this pass. Now that we're inside of the pineapple pass. So let's collapse the cherry logos. We can hide them now. We also want to hide the sprinkled cherries, but we'll get to that part in a moment. Let's go back to setup mode, and we're going to do something a little bit different. So for this, we need to hide the cherry just so that's out of our way. And what we want to do is to ramp up the saturation and a little bit of the value of the pineapple logo. Now it's got a specular layer here, and it's kind of washing it out a little bit, which is fine. But we also want it to stand out a little bit more color-wise. And we can do that with a process layer. So let's go ahead and add a new layer inside of the pineapple logo group. So hit add layer, go to processing, and then add a process layer. And by default, of course, hue, saturation, and value have not changed. So you'll see no change in the preview render. And what we want to do is to change the saturation to value, as I mentioned. So let's bump this up. Let's go 15% saturation and 50% value. You could see that everything in the scene is actually being affected. So what we need to do is to set a layer mask for the process layer. And we can do that by duplicating our Pineapple Modo's layer. Oh, and it looks like I forgot to set the bump layer here. Let's right click, go to surface shading, and select the bump. And that, of course, yes, now it's popping out. So we're good there. And now back to the process layer. The easiest way to get this is to use one of the bump or spec mounts, since it's already set up with the values that we likely want. However, we do have a high and low value editing on those, so we will need to change that after we duplicate this. So let's right click on the one we're using for bump, duplicate that. Let's change the low value to 0. And one of the things that I mentioned earlier on in this series, and that's where when you use an alpha channel with the horizontal and vertical repeat set to reset, things can get a little crazy. Here is where we're going to tackle that. Now, just a recap on why it's a little crazy. Basically, what horizontal and vertical repeat do is that when it's set to reset, any value outside of the whole image will be reset to whatever it was before we applied the image, and can result in different effects. And since our image has pixels on the edge of the image that are alpha transparency, what we want to do with that is set it to edge. And what edge will do is that it will continue the transparent pixels along the entire layer. So keep that in mind. Let's set this to edge, go to the texture layer, and set the alpha channel to alpha only. And what this will do is, instead of using the alpha channel and the color values, is it will use the alpha only. right? So these two settings are very important to do. Otherwise, we'll get a completely different result. So now if we drag this layer on top of the process node, you'll see that the process layer is only affecting the pineapple itself and nothing else. Let's change the hue to demonstrate exactly what's going on here with a drastic color to 180 degrees. And you can see that it's purple and blue, and nothing else around it is purple or blue or has shifted hue. So we can do some pretty interesting things without having to go into Photoshop to adjust our colors. We can do this on a per pass basis. All right, let's change the hue of this back to 0 degrees because this is exactly what we want right here. And now, since we're in setup mode, let's hit apply, and that will apply that to setup mode. We want those changes to be global for that pineapple and not just in the pass. Now we need to adjust the color of the gradient for our background, and we want something that's a little more pineapple hued. So we'll have a yellow, orange, and a light green color. Now we're going to be using the process node for this rather than keyframing new values into our gradient. So let's collapse this group here and go to the whole box group where we have that vertical gradient. Let's add a new layer. Do a process layer again under processing, and we'll call this one BG process for background, and it's going to affect only what's inside of the material group. So it does respect any kind of selection sets and materials that you may have set. If you want to filter out anything and affect just the specific area, you'll need to apply a layer mask for that, or a group mask, which we don't need to do here. Now I know that I want to change the value of this one to be more pineapple colored like. And if we set the hue to about 320 degrees, it should adjust it to have some interesting oranges, yellows, and greens. I also don't want to use the radial gradient that we're using for the cherries. I want to use our vertical gradient. While we're in setup mode, we're affecting everything here. And now that we have those values already set up, what we can do is to hit apply and then go into our pineapple pass. We have the BG process layer active still, but it's probably still active in setup mode. And sure enough, of course it is. So we need to hide this from setup mode. Let's hit apply to make that happen in setup mode. Go back to the pineapple pass. And of course, it's hidden in the pass as well. So toggle that on, and now it's turned on. Hit apply, and now it's set to our pineapple pass. So we go back to setup. Everything should be exactly how we want it, more or less, excluding the pineapple on the top left-hand corner for the pass. So let's go ahead and set up that pineapple to be visible only in the pineapple pass and the cherries in the main pass or setup mode. So let's go to the top front logos group. We'll unhide the cherries and hide the pineapple. Hit apply, go to the pineapple pass, and unhide the pineapple. So now that's all set. Hit apply. And we're almost there. We only have two things left to do, and that would be to change the sprinkles and the Modo's logo. Let's go ahead and change the Modo's logo now. We're going to do the same thing as we did with the background color and the pineapple by using a process layer. So in the top front logos group, let's add another process. So we'll bring this on down, place it above the Modo's logo. And we're going to need to create a layer mask. But we should probably rename this. Call this Modo's logo process. And what we could do is just duplicate the bump map for the Modo's logo. And let's make sure the values are what we want. It looks like it's inverted, so we'll turn that off. The opacity is at 50, which needs to be at 100%. And if you recall, we need to set the alpha channel to alpha only. And we need to change the horizontal and vertical repeat to edge. Otherwise, we'll get weird looking results, and we don't want that. Okay, so let's drag and drop this onto the Modo's logo process. Everything looks good. Now what we need to do is to change the hue of the Modo's logo process. And since the color of the Modo's logo is pretty close to orange, we don't need to shift the hue too much. We could probably go up to about 30-35%. Yeah, that does it. So the color is a little muted, and what I want to do to fix that is to change the saturation to 10%, and I also want to lighten it up a little bit with the value. We'll go to 15%. So now it really stands out and is different than the previous pass. And what we need to do since we've edited these values is to hit apply. Let's go to setup mode real quick, just to make sure that that is how we want it. And we don't need the Modo's logo process to be on in setup mode. So let's hide that, hit apply, go back to pineapple, and make sure that it's still enabled. And sure enough, it is. And now we're good to go on the logo as well. We're about to do a little bit more work with texture locators. Let's go ahead and make sure that they're well named and going to be a lot easier to work with. We'll start with the texture locators for the logos on the top panel here. So let's open that up, top front logos group, and we'll start with the cherries. Expand out all of these images, select one of the texture locators, and sure enough, they're all using the right texture locator. Let's go ahead and rename this. We're going to call this TL for top left, cherry, TLOC for texture locator. That one's all set. Go to the pineapple one now. Expand out all of these so we can see every texture locator. This one just says mixed. Select that one, and luckily for us, it's all the same. It says mixed texture 3, but we don't want that name. Let's call this one TL pineapple, TLOC for texture locator again, and then we can collapse that. Let's do the same thing for the Modo's text logo. Select that texture locator, and that one's more or less named correctly. We're only going to have one of those, so we'll leave that one be. The bursts are all uniquely named, so those ones are fine. Now we've done the top front group, let's go ahead and check the sprinkled cherries. Okay, select the locator. Sure enough, it still has a different name, so let's rename this one here. This one will be sprinkled cherries, TLOC. Before we proceed here, we're actually going to make a group for those, just to keep them a little more organized. So add layer, group, call this one sprinkled cherries. Select all of these layers and place them into the sprinkled cherries. The main reason we're actually doing that is because we're about to create the sprinkled pineapples. We're going to use the same master group here that's being applied to the whole box. And we want to rename this to just sprinkled whole box, because it's not just cherries anymore. It's also the pineapples and whatever else we feel like putting in here. All right, now that we have that cleaned up, let's move on to the nutritional panel, which is under the nutritional panel material group. Let's expand all of those layers. And the texture locators are luckily the same, so click and rename this to, we'll just call this Nutritional Panel TLOC. That one's good to go. And now we have the cellophane panel to work on. So let's expand our cellophane material. And it looks like we need to group these cherries as well. So let's make a material group for that. Call this cello cherries or cherry. Select all of those layers and place them into the cello cherry. Expand out all of those cherries in that group now. Select the texture locator and let's rename these as well. We'll just call this one cello cherry, TLOC. And we also have one more texture locator there under the layer mask for the material, which is the same. So we are good to go on that. Okay, we can collapse all of these, collapse that group and that group. And now we're ready to proceed. Time to do the sprinkled pineapples now. And we're going to do something a little bit different than from the cherries. We'll place one big one on the side of the box here. And then we'll still use a few of the smaller ones on the front. So to start this out, what we need is an image from the pineapple, preferably an entire group, which luckily we already have. So that resides in the top front logos group. Let's turn that one on and expand it out. Collapse all of these. We don't need to see these right now. Let's go ahead and right click and duplicate this. Now we need to make sure that the duplication process got everything across that we want. For example, the effects and the texture locators are correct. In all likelihood, they're not, because sometimes that happens. So yeah, sure enough, it looks like everything is set to diffuse color. We don't have one for spec or bump. And we also need to make sure that the layer mask is intact, which it is, except I'm not sure about the settings just yet. Let's go ahead and take a look at our other pineapple layer mask, and that one looks okay. Yeah, so they're the same. All right, so that's fine. Right off, we should make sure that all the texture locators are the same. So let's expand all of these out. And it looks like they all have different texture locators. Not what we want. Now, I know that the texture locator is correct only for the diffuse color one. And even though you would imagine that it should still be a reference of this layer right here, and these all be the instances of said layer, that's not the case. Actually still referencing these other pineapple layers down here, or this one right here. As you can see when I select it, the texture locator matches between these, and this is simply not wanted. So let's go ahead and fix this. First, we'll rename this texture locator. This one's going to be cello pineapple texture locator. So hit that, and then we'll select all these different layers here. And what we need to do is to select that new cello pineapple texture locator. So make that happen there just by selecting all those and applying it under the Properties tab, Texture Locator, Locator, and select it in the drop-down list. So now they're all set, and we can collapse these again. And let's also rename this group here. We're going to call this one Sprinkled Pineapple. Okay, so just hit enter to make that happen. And now that needs to be placed under the sprinkled group. So just drag and drop this up to that sprinkled full box group. Make sure it gets in the group. Let's go ahead and unpause our preview render so that way we can see what's happening in the preview. And we can see our pineapple up there. And we can hide the previous pineapple since we're done with that for now. Let's select one of these layers or just the texture locator. We're going to activate the move tool with the W key. We're going to place this on the front of the box. Its actual placement is really unnecessary. We don't really need to place this any particular location, but we just want to move it away from the other one. And in fact, let's just put it over on the left side so that way it's kind of out of sight a little bit. Now that we have these set up, what we want to do is to spread them across the surface like we did with the cherries. And we could use the cherry sprinkled source, but what we actually want to do is just create a new one. And the reason is because we don't want a bunch of pineapples on the side here, nor do we want a bunch on the top. And we're going to have them a little bit bigger on the front as well. And for the side, we'll actually just place one manually. Let's make this happen. To do this, we're going to duplicate the cherry sprinkle source. Duplicate that. Let's rename this to pineapple sprinkle source. Let's go to the model tab, go into poly mode, select these polygons here by double clicking these as well by doing the same. Hit the delete key, and now we can go back into item mode, back to the render tab. And now what we need to do is to set the particle source for the image. So let's reselect the layer, go to the texture locators tab, and under the texture replicator sub tab, select the particle source as the pineapple sprinkle source. Now you can see we have tiny little pineapples all over the place. So we'll leave the actual size of the image the same for now, and we'll use the particle size to control how large it is. So let's just go up to about 0.7 for now. They're a little bit larger than I want, so let's try 0.5. 0.5 looks pretty good. We don't want any fading on the image, so we'll turn the fallout bias to 0 and the gain to 100. So that way there's no transparency fall off. We don't need random size, but we do want random rotation. So set this to 360 degrees. We've got a little bit of the pineapple bleeding over on the edge here. I don't really want that either. Let's go back to the model tab and back in poly mode. Let's scale this down on the Y and also on the X. We'll flatten this out a little bit as well, conforming to the surface a little more. Okay, back to the render tab. Yep, that's pretty good. We're not getting the edge bleed anymore, but we want to make sure that we're at least seeing some of these when we have the render boolean on. Let's turn on the render boolean. We're not seeing a whole lot of those. And to fix that, let's go back to the model tab. We'll scale that up on the Y just a touch and out on the X a little bit more as well. But we don't want to get too close to that edge. Go back to the render tab and let's check all of the edges. I can see all of them but two, and we'll go ahead and just manually tweak those in this viewport. So in vertex mode, let's select that vertex, press the W key to move, and then move it up on the Y. All right, we can see a little bit in preview render. We could probably move that up a little bit more. All right, that looks pretty good. And now the top left corner isn't visible as well, so we'll move this one up. Or it is visible, but not too visible. There we go. That looks pretty good right there. Now we're done placing those on the front of the box. Let's go back into item mode, and we're done sprinkling these about the box. And we also want to turn on the process for this, just to make sure that they have the same color values as the logo on the top. So before we press on here, we need to set these layers effects correctly. This one is specular, so it's under basic, specular amount. This one is bump, under surface shading, bump. Now we need to set the correct parameters to these. And we can view those parameters from these sprinkled cherries. And I just noticed that the bump layer for the cherries is actually set to specular amount. Let's make sure we correctly set this to bump. All right, so we'll set the pineapple bump to the same settings here. It looks like the only value that's changed is the low value, 20% low. And let's look at the specular amount. It's inverted. We have opacity at 2%. We have a low value of 50 and a high of 80. Let's go ahead and set that for the pineapple as well. So invert 2% opacity, 50% low, 80% high. And now we are good to go on those layers. And one last thing to note is that you may have seen the saturation and value on the entire box has been bumped up. And what I want to point out as to why that's happening, which we'll fix here, is that this process layer for these sprinkled pineapples has a layer mask that doesn't work. And the reason it's not working is because certain things can't be masked in this way when using a particle source. The only solution really in this case is to simply delete that process layer and accompanying mask. So we'll just delete that, and now everything returns back to its normal color.